Well, again, I appreciate this opportunity to share a little bit about some weed control issues that we particularly deal with in grass pastures. Is going to be my primary focus tonight as we walk through that. But as Dare alluded to, it's kind of hard to think about weeds when we're covered up in snow and ice. So it doesn't seem like there's as much of an immediate need, but within a few weeks, we certainly are going to see some changes as far as the vegetative growth that exists. In fact, this is a photo I took a few years ago between Christmas and New Year's. There are some plants that are still growing despite the weather conditions that we're having, and this is an example of one of them that continues to grow throughout the winter months. It has to get extremely cold for this plant to go totally dormant for the time period of the winter months. But we certainly have a variety of other cool season weeds that are such as this poison hemlock, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But as we move on into the springtime, we'll start seeing some of our spring wildflowers. And certainly what comes to the top of the page as far as ones we're most concerned about, or we get a lot of questions about, is this one being Buttercup, which certainly gets a lot of attention as we move into to May and April, and we start seeing the flowers from this plant. But these are the kind of plants that we need to be thinking about this time of year in relative to developing some type of strategies to try to control or deal with these particular weeds if we don't want to see as much evidence of them as we go into the spring of the year. And these are mostly what you might consider as cool season weeds. These are plants that grow best in the cooler temperatures or cooler climates that we experience starting in the fall and through the winter and then the early spring. The three primary ones I've got highlighted here that probably most familiar with us is poison hemlock, the thistles, particularly the biennial thistles, particularly the musk thistle, as well as buttercup that I mentioned a few minutes ago. There are a few others that I put in this group of things that we need to be thinking about perhaps here as we move out of February and on into the early spring months. And that is what I consider as more of the warm season perennials. In fact, curly dock's probably more of a cool season perennial, but these are plants that we observe most often during the middle of the summer months, but yet they start their active growth fairly early and have some vegetative growth that there are some things we could do to try to minimize their impact if we wanted to. So those are some of the plants I want to focus on a little bit later tonight. But let's kind of review a little bit about some of the weed issues that we deal with and what are some principles behind the weeds that we observe. And there's a variety of factors that promote weed problems. And usually when I use this slide, I allow the audience to give me some feedback or some things that they feel like that impact weeds and the weeds that we see. But I sort of boil it down to two primary areas. And one is the environment. This is the aspect of, we have cooler seasons. There are some weeds that thrive better under cooler, wetter environments. And then when we have a dry year or dry season, there are other weeds that continue to take advantage of that environment over other environments, as well as just the general environment of the soil characteristics of the basic land resources that we have. And certainly your rockier type soils versus soils that have a better soil base is going to be more problematic, or wetter soil conditions, if that matters. The environment, that's the one we have little or no control over. Now, the management practices are those things that we may or may not do that influence the weed problems that we have and observe. And sometimes these weed issues may start out fairly small, but over time, because of the different practices that we are implementing or utilizing, we might intensify or minimize some of the weedy type plants that we might see. And certainly, when we think about that part of it, the management side of it, one of our bigger factors is certainly areas that look like this that we have on the in our beef cattle operations, because we see a lot of weeds, especially in high traffic areas, and particularly areas where we're feeding during the winter months, especially. We get a lot of traffic. We don't have much of an opportunity for the desirable vegetation to kind of cover in, and we have a lot of open, thin, bare spots, and that's the areas where a lot of these weeds have a chance to become established and begin to dominate that particular area of the field. This happens to be a field that I looked at or I did some work with a few years back. This field, even though from the photo you couldn't tell it, this was a winter feeding area. And when the vegetation began to grow in the spring, early summer months, the amount of cockleburr and the ragweed, common ragweed, was the percent of those weeds which much more dominant than desirable grasses that would be considered more desirable as far as utilizing it for grazing or other purposes. So thinking about that as some of the things that influence some of the weed problems that we have. So what are the tools in the toolbox for control? Well, in pastures, I consider them sort of perennial systems in regards to the type of vegetation that we're trying to maintain on those areas. So we have some different tools in the toolbox, and certainly the one that comes to the top of the list is our mechanical or mowing practices, the opportunity to mow and basically remove top growth. We can utilize cultural practices to a certain extent, and probably should be thinking about that, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, of the impact of cultural practices relative to weed management. We do have some herbicide tools that we can use, particularly those that will control broadleaf type weeds. A couple other things I have on my list here is biological control agents. We'll give you at least one example of an insect that has really helped us from a control perspective, but also the animals that are grazing these fields can have an impact on control of some weeds, particularly if you change up the species of animals, like utilizing goats and so forth can be a weed control tool. And then the other one that we don't think about as much is certainly prevention. And that is not allowing something to get established and become problematic in the future. And one of the examples I like to use with prevention is, this time of year, we're feeding a lot of hay. And sometimes the hay that we utilize doesn't necessarily come from our farm. We may be, out of necessity, need to purchase hay from someone else. And I suspect that most of that hay that we purchase is weed-free. That being said, that doesn't mean that all the hay that we bring on the farm is going to cause us weed problems. In fact, many times it doesn't manifest itself as an issue, but occasionally we may bring in something other onto our farm as a result of feeding hay that could be problematic. In fact, one of the issues, and from a prevention standpoint that I'll mention as a sideline, one of the major issues we're dealing with in the grain crops area is Palmer amaranth or Palmer pigweed. And a lot of that seed was introduced as an animal feed in cottonseed hulls. And subsequently, the manure is spread out on these fields and then ultimately end up being used on some of our grain crop fields. And then we manifest a problem. So I don't want to belabor the prevention side of it, but sometimes we can be one of the main ways in which we get things started that we prefer not to deal with. So going back to mowing and clipping pastures, and as I mentioned, a lot of what mowing achieves for us is it removes the top growth of unwanted vegetation. Certainly we typically will mow whenever the grass is grazed down oftentimes, but that's the intent. It also can keep our desirable forages in a more vegetated competitive growth stage in some cases. And if we can time it well, it's possible to actually decrease the population of some annual weeds. Basically, if we can target the mowing to prevent viable seed from being produced, that can be an asset. As far as perennials, impact with mowing, yes, if you do a lot of frequent mowing, you may help deplete some of those root reserves, but in many cases, the perennials or the population of those perennials are not generally affected. The bottom line is the fact that we use mowing, the timing is probably the most important question. When do you mow? And that is not one of those, it's one of those depends answers, because we have different weeds beginning their maturity stages at different times throughout the years. We have the cool season plants that tend to flower and produce seed in the spring. We have some more towards midsummer, and then we have other plants that are more in their start their reproductive phases more towards the fall of the year. So there's no one specific time of the year, I think, to achieve the best with mowing, but depending on what are some of their target weed species are, is the best time to consider mowing. As far as cultural practices, I am somewhat convinced, having looked at a number of, or being involved in weed management issues and forages for a number of years now, that our cultural practices and our management may be at least 50, if not 60 or 70% of weed control. And it all, and I'm not the extension forage specialist, but this kind of falls a lot under their hat. But some of the key points I wanted to leave with you is that, proper fertility, particularly soil pH levels maintained where they need to be, can be an asset as far as producing the forage grasses to make them more competitive. And that really boils down to competitiveness, or making our desirable forages much more competitive so they can compete against the emergence and then the growth of some of these weedy plants. Sometimes that may mean interseeding, basing to thicken up the stands to, again, make them more competitive, allowing less sunlight to reach the soil surface, where a lot of the annual weed seeds germinate. In fact, some of our annual weeds could be indicators. We see a lot of problematic annual weeds. It may be an indication that we do have some open bare spots in some of those field areas. And then the third bullet there, it probably goes along more with hay production, but avoid cutting forage grasses right at ground level. Again, avoiding sunlight, as minimizing the amount of sunlight that hits the ground, because for weed seed to germinate, it basically requires sunlight along with precipitation or good moisture is two of the key factors, along with temperature, are the three key factors in which a lot of weed seed germinate, particularly the annual weeds. Basically, what I'm trying to say is utilizing those practices or activities that will promote the growth of desirable forage species to minimize the impact of the undesirable plants. And that's the target, or that's the ultimate goal when we talk about cultural practices relative to weed control. And then another part of that I haven't mentioned yet is just overall grazing practices. Again, this is something that we have some control over. And one of the real dilemmas you have as beef producers is in the spring of the year, a lot of times we have more grass than animals. And there's not too much difficulty of having enough grass to be sustainable, maintaining good vegetative cover. But as we move into the summer months, particularly if we rely a lot on cool season forage grass species, we might have more animals than we have grass or available grass to grow. And then we start running into the scenario of the weedy plants, which oftentimes, particularly some of the perennial ones, would have some deeper tap roots, are able to take advantage of that situation and really thrive in that environment relative to animals who's removing top growth. In fact, when we talk about the animals, the effect of grazing on weeds, grazing is selective defoliation. The animals are sort of like we are. We go to the buffet line, we're going to pick out what we like and leave what we don't like. And as a result of that, it puts selection pressure on those desirable forage species, particularly when we run into those environmental conditions where the desirable plants are not growing well. We see this shift in more towards the undesirable species, or the weedy plants, if you will, and particularly plants like the thistles and tall ironweed, cockleburr, the ragweed, spiny amaranth, just to name a few of them. Those plants are plants that animals tend to not graze. If anything, they might nibble on some of those plants, but they will graze around those plants. And over time, then those plants, if they're allowed to go through their full reproductive stages of growth throughout a season and continue to reproduce, then they become much more the dominant part of the field. We can use certainly livestock stocking rates, the timing of grazing, even among different animal species. They tend to graze at different levels can have an impact on that selectivity that we're talking about. One of the things I like about rotational grazing systems from a weed management perspective is that allows us to utilize our grazing practices as a way to manage some of the weed problems, particularly if we tie that in with mowing or clipping when needed to minimize the ability of some of those weeds to produce a lot of new seed. So now I want to talk about some specific weed problems, coming back to where I started as far as some of the plants we might target this time of year. This is a plant that you're more apt to see at this growth stage as we move into June, which is poison hemlock, a very tall plant, white blooms. In fact, this plant, as I understand it, was introduced as an ornamental in the U.S. In the Northeast. Unfortunately, it's got a foothold across lots of areas, and this is not too hard to recognize when it's in the full bloom stage. Once it blooms in June and produces flowers and seed, then that plant is done. It has completed its life cycle. We might see some remnants of the stems that are left as we move into late summer. But for the most part, like a lot of other, this plant's considered a biennial, meaning it may take up to 2 years to complete its life cycle. I'm not so sure it grows as more so as a winter annual, at least in our state. But this is the plant that I showed you a picture of at the beginning of poison hemlock. In fact, if you drive, once the snow and ice melts, if you drive up and down the road, and I have already seen a fair amount of this plant already this winter, and some of them even a foot or more in diameter. It's growing right on the ground. It's called the Rosette Stage. And once you get a patch started, and this plant actually starts germinating or coming up in September. You can sometimes see evidence of this plant beginning to germinate even as early as September. And then it goes through this winter dormant phase. And then just as soon as the weather begins to warm, those rosettes will begin to expand, and then the flower stalks will come off the ground. Certainly find a lot of it along fence rows, underneath tree lines. This is a photo I took a few years ago, even out in the middle of this hayfield. And I suspect in this hayfield where I see this poison hemlock are areas where you have less desirable grass growth. But the problem about this plant in these fence rows and along these tree lines is it's a lot more difficult to mow or clip those plants to keep those from producing viable seed. So we need to know where those spots is. One of the keys, I think, to poison hemlock control is recognizing where we had problems this past summer, and that's where we need to look for the plant for this season. The leaves will look a little bit like a carrot leaf. It's in the carrot plant family, if you will. But one of the telltale signs of poison hemlock versus some of the other plants that look vegetatively similar to poison hemlock is these purple blotches, and there's no hairs on the stems. In fact, there's purple blotches can also show up on the leaf petioles. The other plant that looks a lot like this that's confusing is is wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace, but it tends to come up a little bit later in this into the year, and it will have hairs on the stems. As far as control, 2,4-D will work pretty well in this plant. We catch it in this young rosette stage. Once it comes off the ground, then the 2,4-D by itself may not quite get the job done as well than Weedmaster or the Dicamba 2,4-D mixes. Some of the higher end products like Grazon and the new one called Duracore should be quite effective on it. But again, this is the time to target that. Late February through April. In fact, just as soon as the temperatures turn back towards 60, even nighttime temperatures of 40, that 40-60 window of temperatures, that's the ideal temperatures for this plant to be actively growing. And for spot treatments is probably the way to go in a lot of areas, particularly along fence lines on the ground. When it's real young, you may not have to be as cautious about it, but the other real caution about using herbicides to control poison hemlock is once those plants get some growth on it, as the name implies, this plant is highly toxic, and it doesn't take much of this plant to be eaten by an animal choosing to graze on this plant to be problematic. Typically, they do not graze the plant if there's other desirable forages available for them to graze on. But if that's all they have available, or I have seen this happen a few times in a field that was sprayed with a herbicide in the spring, and I'm talking about when the plants were up off the ground, and then the animals were more prone to use it to graze it, and then subsequently there were problems from a toxicity standpoint. The other one I want to briefly mention is the musk or nodding thistle. We don't see as much of this plant as we used to. It's still out there. In fact, the poison hemlock, unfortunately, has replaced a lot of the same areas where we used to have a lot of thistles. This one, again, we can effectively control with the 2,4-D or the Weedmaster, Grazon, for example. But right when this plant is young in this rosette growth stage, that's the best time that we're going to get the most effect from a herbicide treatment. We can mow for control, preferably probably after the bolting stage, meaning after the flower stalks begin to emerge, but before the flowers are produced. And I'll have people may comment and say, well, I do mow it and I still get some flowers produced. Well, if we time it just as you begin to see the purple bloom start to develop, yes, you may get some regrowth, an amount of a few flowers produced, but it'd be a lot less seed produced. And that's the key. We don't want this plant to produce seed than it would be if we wait until the plant's in full, the flowering and seed production stage. This is one that one of the reasons I think we've been somewhat successful of in those past 30 years for musk thistle control was the introduction of the thistlehead weevil that does feed on the seed of the plant. And again, it's helping us. It's not 100% effective, but it's greatly helped reduce the population of this weed. If you're not familiar with that, if you go out and look at some thistle plants that are in full bloom and you see these brown heads on the plant, you still see some pink flowers indicating seed probably produced there. But these brown heads are indication that the weevil has been active on that particular plant. What the adults do is they lay their eggs underneath the developing flower head. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae burrow into the head, and they eat out the seed. So vegetatively, it doesn't have an impact on the vegetative growth, but it's preventing new seed production, and that has gone a long way, I think, of helping to reduce that population. But I still find musk thistle in a few areas throughout the year. Now, getting back to, as we move on into the spring of the year, again, this quite picturesque landscape that we have in a lot of our fields in Kentucky. When I first started noticing buttercup in the late 80s and early 90s, it was mainly along the southern counties along the southern border is where you found most of the buttercup. But now it's gotten a lot more widespread in the state. in a lot of different areas where we're grazing animals. In fact, when I have a question about buttercup control, it's almost inherent that this is a field that's being heavily grazed, particularly during the fall and the winter months, where there's very little grass cover at the time this plant begins to germinate, either in the fall, but this is one that can germinate also in the late, what I consider the late winter, as there's some that's already germinated back in the fall of the year, but we'll still have some that probably will still germinate as we move into out of March into early April. When you see a field like this with these yellow flowers, that's when people get more concerned about the plant. We can see it. It's real obvious. But when you have these yellow flowers, and this picture may not show up very well on your computer screen, but you see these yellow flowers inside that flower petals, and there's 5 petals, shiny petals. And there's in these individual flowers, the seed is already beginning to develop. And there may be only a few hundred seed on an individual flower, but who can count the number of flowers that's out in this field? So you have a tremendous seed bank, and this plant only reproduces by seed for all practical purposes. And some of these fields, we've allowed them to start out as small patches, and within a few years, a couple years, we produce a lot of seed. And then we have a tremendous amount of seed bank that we're dealing with. There's actually a number of different species of buttercup that can be found in Kentucky. I've named a few of them here. There's about 5 or 6 of them that I'm aware of that is in the state. Some are hairy, hispid. The small flower buttercup has a much smaller flower, and it has a few little distinct characteristics that differ from the general flower characteristics of these others, but again, they produce those yellow flowers. As far as control, mowing is, for most practical purposes, ineffective because this plant does not get very tall. You will get enough growth that you could clip it off and suppress some top growth, and you might reduce some of the seed being produced, but it's not going to be as effective. Cultural practices. If you can establish and maintain good pasture stands, that goes a long way to prevent this plant from germinating. And that's where it starts. Once it's germinated, there's not as much we can do here. But if we have fields, unfortunately, a lot of these fields that have a lot of buttercup are the fields that we need to utilize for winter grazing. But if we have some fields that we're not using during the winter months, if we can allow to get some better grass stands established, that would help us a lot to cut down the amount of buttercups that are there. Herbicide wise, sort of take your pick, the 2,4-D, Weedmaster, this new Duracor. Again, the preferred time of treatment is usually March through early April. There have been some individuals have made some fall treatments and been successful at control of buttercup. But usually the spring of the year, and the earlier in the spring, the better. Actually, this is a study that was done a number of years ago by Dr. Witt, who's retired from our department. Even 2,4-D at a quart per acre was highly effective on buttercup. You don't need as much. This plant seems to be highly sensitive. Of course, Weedmaster has 2,4-D in it, as well as Crossbow. The Cimarron worked pretty well also, but Cimarron, I'll show you a slide here in a minute about what Cimarron has in it. But that active ingredient can cause some grass stunning, particularly on fescue sometimes. Again, the other problem about buttercup is there can be some different leaf shapes in the vegetative growth stage among these different species, and that sometimes makes it difficult for people to realize that that's the plant that they're seeing out in some of these fields, and they fail to recognize it until it gets to the flowering stage. But the other thing that intrigues me about buttercup is how well it can be helped behind a fence. And it doesn't have to be a good fence, just a good just a woven wire fence, the amount of buttercup that you'll see inside the fence versus on the other side of the fence. Why is that? Well, it's not the fence itself. Again, this to me is a great illustration of the amount of ground cover that you have, in this case, a hay field with a good stand of grass hay, and you can just go right down the line of that fence, and you'll see the buttercup on the side of the fence where the cattle have been grazing. Again, particularly those fall and winter months, compared to a field where we have a good grass stand. So this points again to my point about practices to try to improve the stand of the desirable forages goes a long way to help minimize the impact of a weed like buttercup. Although I also recognize, though, that there are some field areas that we need to utilize for winter grazing. Now I want to move on to a plant that we typically see in midsummer, and that is chicory. Some people call it bluebells, that have these real showy plants that open up early in the morning. When it gets to this flowering stage, we have a lot of long stems which the flowers are produced. But the active growth of the plant is the vegetative growth, the rosette. In fact, the plant, when it's much smaller, will look a lot like a dandelion. And sometimes it's hard to separate this plant from dandelions when they're in the true vegetative growth stage. So as we come out of the winter months, think about dandelions, plants that you see in the early spring that bloom in March. Well, chicory doesn't really start blooming until we get into late June or July, but the growth pattern is the same. They're perennials, they have a taproot, but that is the stage of growth that we can target a plant like this. This is a demonstration trial that I did in Lincoln County a few years ago. Again, 2,4-D alone by itself was highly effective. I sprayed some different strips of different herbicides, but 2,4-D looked as good as anything else that I sprayed. Over here on the left, you see the chicory that dominated a lot of this area. Now, what you will also see, this happens to be the part of the field that they use for the winter feeding of hay, is one reason why it has a lot of these weedy plants in it. But the other plant that you might see some remnants of is actually white clover. So even 2,4-D applied there in mid-May did allow the white clover at least to rebound and still be present. Again, some odor data to illustrate the control of chicory with 2,4-D as a rosette in pre-flower stage, about 2 weeks apart. Weed Master was highly effective, as well as Grazon. But 2,4-D again will work on this plant if we catch it at the right growth stage when it's relatively young here in the spring of the year. Again, the time of year, take your pick, and this is the stage of growth that we're after. We can also do that in the fall of the year, a perennial weed like chicory. The other thing I'll mention about chicory is I see it more often in fields that do get a lot more maybe mowing or clipping of top growth of pastures. Is where that becomes a little bit more common to see it. That's not always true, but I put this picture in here also to show, mowing is a way to try to help suppress top growth of the perennial like chicory, at least to remove the top stems and the flowers. Of course, the other side of chicory is, as some of you are well aware, there is a forage chicory that's sowed for grazing purposes. It's the same species, it's just varieties that are more leafy that might provide some value to animals. But animals will graze this when it's young, but they typically do not graze it when it's more mature. So I want to pause there for talking about some specific plants and maybe mention some of the tools in the toolbox related to herbicides. I've alluded to a time or two already. Still probably the most common herbicide that's used in a lot of grass pastures or needed in a lot of grass pastures is just 2,4-D. Comes in various products. A lot of them are either Ester or Amine formulations. Get questions quite frequently, what's the difference between a 2,4-D ester versus a 2,4-D amine? Just my quick summary would be the 2,4-D ester products tend to load a little quicker through the leaves of the plants compared to the amine, but the esters are more volatile than the amine formulation. So when we get to some of the more sensitive areas, we've got to be a little more cautious. The 2,4-D amine formulation is probably the better choice there as far as between those two formulations of 2,4-D. Even though this ester will say low volatile ester, it's still more volatile potential than the amine, particularly when we get to the hotter temperatures in the summertime. There is a newer formulation, a 2,4-D choline salt formulation called Freelix. This is not quite widely being marketed yet for a lot of farmstead purposes, but it can be used on grazed pastures, fields that are used for forage purposes. But that's the newest formulation that has the even less volatile form of 2,4-D than even the amine formulation. The other group of products are the dicamba-based products. We typically don't use dicamba by itself often in pasture situations. Usually it's a pre-mixture of dicamba with 2,4-D. The older product was called Weedmaster, Rifle D, I think Brash, and there's a number of other products that had those two active ingredients in the mix. Then the triclopyr-based products are things most familiar as Crossbow. There's beginning to see a few what I consider generic or off-brand forms. One like called Crossroads, which is triclopyr 2,4-D. We've seen Pasture Guard around for a few years now. They trade out the 2,4-D with this fluroxapyr. We often think about Pasture Guard helping us, even Crossbow, for some more woody plant species that we might deal with, but there are some other situations like tall ironweed where the triclopyr is one of our better chemistries for that particular weed. Then we have the Aminopyralic based herbicides. By itself, it was marketed as Milestone. We typically don't recommend or use that much in pastures by itself. We've used a fair amount of Grazon Next. It used to be called Forefront, which is a premix with 2,4-D. Chaparral has been around for a few years. It has this metsulfuron in it. And from a weed control perspective, those two chemistries complement each other pretty well. It was also being marketed for a while for seed head suppression of fescue because this metsulfuron can suppress growth of fescue. It's a good thing we talk about seed head reduction, but it's not as desirable because it can reduce the amount of forage available for grazing in the spring of the year, but it's a trade-off. Then this new Duracor has Aminopyralic with fluoropyroxafen. This chemistry actually was first introduced for weed control in rice, but this is the new product that hit the market this last year and changing this 2,4-D out with this other synthetic auxin herbicide called fluoropyroxafen. Again, metsulfuron by itself, not as available as it used to be. It used to be sold as a product called Cimarron, but it can be purchased by itself in a couple of products called Patriot Pure Stand. I think I saw one the other day called MSM 60, which is basically metsulfuron, and there's another active. Now this chemistry is not a growth regulator, whereas all these other chemistries I mentioned beforehand are synthetic auxin or growth regulator type herbicides, and we got to be a little more cautious about using those products in the middle of the summer when the conditions are more conducive for off-site movement of herbicides. Another new one, relatively new one on the market that I want to spend a moment to talk about is Sharpen. This product actually was first introduced for use in corn and soybean. We use it a fair amount for burn down control of some weeds and some soybeans and corn. It can now be used in grass pastures. Unlike the synthetic auxins, it's more of a contact type herbicide. In other words, there might be some translocation into the plant, but we're relying more on leaf burn to get the control. Now, what's unique about this product is it's mainly targeting some of our annual broadleaf weeds, things like the cocklebur and the ragweed and perhaps pigweeds. we need to be targeting those weeds when they're relatively small. Is the best time to get the best control from a foliar perspective. The application rate's relatively low compared to some of the other products that we talked about. We're talking about 1 to 2 fluid ounces per acre. We need to tank mix it with the methylated seed oil to get the best activity. What's the difficult side of this is it comes in gallons per jug, so we can spray a lot of acres with just a gallon jug, and unfortunately the cost of this is fairly comparable to 2,4-D on a per acre basis, but the amount of quantity that you might need to purchase may limit some utilization. There are no pre-harvest cutting or grazing restrictions, so in fact it doesn't have any reseeding waiting periods. So there are some positives there. Probably the biggest positive that I see with Sharpen, if we want to target these specific weeds, being able to apply a product like this in midsummer with less concern about volatility and loss from offsite movement due to volatility. The other thing to keep in mind, though, Sharpen is not a perennial herbicide for perennial weed control. And oftentimes in a lot of our pasture situations, we have some perennial weeds that we deal with as well. So it may not be the best fit in that situation. So I want to share a study that I looked at Sharpen a little bit closer, particularly to target the cockleburr and the ragweed. I showed you this photo earlier with a heavy population of both those two species in the field. So we looked at Sharpen at the mid-rate range at 1.5 fluid ounces per acre. Also had Permit, which I haven't mentioned tonight, but it's another herbicide we can use in pastures, although it's probably a niche, again, another niche herbicide. Compared to 2,4-D, the Weedmaster, Grazing Next, and then I used Pasture Guard instead of Crossbow because I wanted something that didn't have 2,4-D in it as my other synthetic auxin or growth regulator type herbicide. And these were the use rates that we used. If you look at the cockleburr control, and this is data that was collected September the 13th, basically 90 days after application, or 3 months after application. The treatments went on in mid-June when cockleburr was 6 to 12 inches tall. And if you can see here, the Sharpen was as effective as 2,4-D, Weedmaster, or Grazing Next for giving us what I consider season-long cockleburr control. The Permit also was as effectively statistically, just a few escapes that happened with Permit. The weakest one was the Pasture Guard in that group of treatments that we were evaluating. We also had a mowing treatment when we came in August, just before the seed began to develop, and we had about 70% control. A lot of this was due to the fact that we had some green vegetative growth still at the time this evaluation occurred. So here's Weedmaster, pretty typical what you see as far as this growth regulator effect. This is 14 days after the application. The stems are twisted up, the leaves are folded over, and that's pretty typical what we see for a lot of growth regulator type herbicides. Compared to Sharpen, here's we see the contact, the quick burn. In fact, you'll notice this within a day or two of where you've been. In fact, this field was, the whole field outside of my treated areas was also sprayed with Sharpen, and it was just a crisp brown. You'd think you killed the whole plant. It did. Sharpen may create a little bit of tip burn on these the grasses, but it quickly outgrows it, and you wouldn't notice it. Again, for cockleburr control, so I think Sharpen's another tool we can put in the toolbox to tackle weeds like cockleburr, where we have these spots in the field, along with 2,4-D and some of the other herbicides. But to get the best control chemical-wise, this needs to happen in June and July. I don't know how many times I've been on farms and fields that get sprayed in August for cockleburr control, even after the seed burrs have developed. At that point in time, it's over with, because once these seed burrs are developed, this plant is going south on its own, and it's going to die out quickly. This is one, I think, mowing or clipping fields at the right time, just before those seeds are produced. Typically, this plant, regardless of the size, is going to produce those seed pods or burrs starting in in early to mid-August, or by mid-August is when you start seeing it because it's daylight dependent. If we can mow or clip those fields in early to mid-August, we can go a long way to reduce new seed being produced. This is a plant that the seed are not as long-lived as a lot of other weeds type plants. So if we can prevent seed production for a few years, we can greatly reduce the population as well as improving overall forage growth. The other weed that was in that field was common ragweed, which is a more typical ragweed that we see in pastures. The other ragweed that we get questions about is lance leaf ragweed. I'm not talking about the real tall ragweed that we call giant ragweed, but another one that kind of grows about the same height as common ragweed is lance leaf ragweed. But the data I'm going to show you is on common ragweed. And if you look at Sharpen, Weed Master, Grazing Next were certainly the best treatments that we had in this particular study that we conducted. And we can see your 2,4-D was not quite as good as well as a pasture guard for targeting common ragweed. So that 2,4-D alone may not get the job done like we would hope. And then Permit was even down to 80% control. So Permit was not near as good as the other 5 herbicides. And then mowing again provided us about 70% control. So mowing does help us if that's the primary tool we want to utilize, but we can certainly get some more mileage as far as actually killing some of those plants by using a herbicide treatment. To give you an idea what some of this looked like, here's the Sharpen treatment. This actually might have been 60 days after treatment, and fairly good control of all the broadleaf weeds. There were a few perennials plants that escaped, particularly the ground cherry species that I recall that was in this particular site. There weren't many of them, but again, the perennial weeds are not going to be, other than maybe burn some tops off of them, they're not going to control it. Here's Weed Master, again, excellent control of the overall broadleaf weeds that were in this field, as well as the Grazing Next was very good. But what do you see? So we took care of the broadleaf weeds, but the other side of the coin is we also released the annual grasses, the weedy grasses, particularly foxtail and crabgrass were the 2 predominant ones that were there. And that creates a whole new challenge for us, but it points to the fact that weeds are going to occupy those bare areas. So we took out the ones that were most dominant, being the cocklebur and the ragweed, but we also left the opportunity for the weedy grasses to get a foothold. Again, other things for ragweed control is clipping or mowing, again, before seed produced. Same time period as the cocklebur, early August is the best time to do that. We see a lot of common ragweed in these fields. We have a lot of open bare spots to deal with. We need to thicken up those forage stands if feasible, and are not fields that we heavily utilize during the winter months. So to kind of wrap up some of my comments tonight, and then I'll take some questions. When is the best time of year to apply herbicides? Well, unfortunately, it's just like mowing. You have to pick and choose the weeds that you're trying to control as far as picking the herbicide that fits best. And that means we got to become more familiar with the life cycle and the growth patterns of some of these weedy type plants, and particularly trying to target them in their vegetative growth stages, keeping in mind that herbicides work best in general on younger, more actively growing weeds. And when they're actively growing is when they're more susceptible to control. So in the spring of the year, here in March, April, we got the biennial thistles again. The hemlock, buttercup are good examples of cool season weeds that we can target. Again, just as soon as this weather breaks, I suspect if we jump back into the 60-degree temperature, daytime temperatures, we're going to see a lot of active growth beginning to develop. And that's the time to start looking for these kind of weeds. Midsummer, the ragweeds, cocklebur, for example, the summer annuals, I like to see them targeted more midsummer by herbicides, but here we have to pick and choose the sites in which we might want to make an application, because if we have a pasture field that's just adjacent to a subdivision or somebody's homestead, we got to be a lot more cautious, or particularly someone's grapes or tobacco or or highly valuable crops, we want to be real cautious about making some of those applications. And then for a lot of our perennial weeds, I like to target those more in late summer, early fall. In fact, what works best on these two weeds, I think, is a mowing in midsummer, then followed by the herbicide application with its regrowth. We get more herbicide in an actively growing plant tissue, as well as we get more translocation down to the root system of the plant. So kind of wrapping up here with some comments that I've prepared for tonight. So what can we do this time of year? Well, the first point I want to leave you with is think about some of those fields where you're having problems, and some of these annual weeds especially. Maybe the best thing we need to do is interseed more forage grasses or legumes. We need to thicken up those stands, make them more competitive, to be much more desirable forage stand that doesn't eliminate the weed. Doesn't eliminate the weeds, but you're trying to give the advantage to the desirable forages over the unwanted weed species. And then if we want to target some of our weed problems, or cool season weeds especially, spot treatments or broadcasting, even 2,4-D goes a long way to manage weeds like hemlock, the thistles, the buttercup, and the chicory. Again, knowing what they look like in the early growth stages, then we can be more highly targeted at getting the control that we're looking for. So with that, I'm going to stop there and entertain any questions that you might have.
All right, JD, sure do appreciate it. That was fantastic. As always, we already have a list of questions for you. Now, I think you've covered a couple of these. I'm going to go ahead and read them, and if you want to add some more, then go ahead. But has there been much research on Duracore? I see a lot about 2,4-D and Gray Zone, but I've done some reading about the new Duracore and was curious if you have any info. And I think you hit that, but anything else to add?
No, I have not made a lot of direct comparisons with Duracore compared to the other herbicides. From what I have seen, I mean, I've seen some plots. I've seen some trials that have been put out, but my general summary on Duracore is the control you can expect out of Duracore is fairly equivalent, would be very equivalent to what you would get out of Gray Zone Next. There's very few weeds, I think, between those two herbicides that I can discern at this point in time. In fact, I asked a colleague the other day, did he know of any differences? And he said, for all practical purposes, they're very similar as far as the control you expect.
Right.
And the driver is the Aminopyralic primarily.
Okay. Actually, while we're chatting, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen because they're going to want their Cape code for one thing. Is that up there now? Everything you seeing mine, JD?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Next question. Once again, I think you got this one, but where does chaparral fall in the herbicide range for these? And now I think that came in when you were talking about the buttercup, but and I think you kind of covered that a little bit later anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly chaparral and the other Aminopyralic based herbicides will control buttercup and some of these other weeds, but you have, when you trade that off with, I think you can get as good a control out of 2,4-D for that. If that's the main target weed that you're after, the key comes in, are there other species that you're also trying to target? Now, one of the difficulties in regards to using some of those herbicides is that, we'd like to target buttercup and also control tall ironweed. Well, tall ironweed's not up and growing at that point in time when we need to spray for buttercup. And unfortunately, we can not get, extended activity out of those herbicide products, which are primarily foliar active, more so than in residual activity that we can expect from them.
Okay. Had a couple of questions on this. What's the best thing to do about Perilla mint?
Perilla mint's another one of those plants we got to be a little more cautious about because of its potential toxicity. That is one I think we again can control with with primarily 2,4-D or a Weed Master type product, chemical wise, but we got to be cautious again about spraying that plant if we have animals have access to grazing it, because when it gets treated, then the ability of those animals might be a little more prone to be attracted to grazing that plant. Unfortunately, a lot of Perilla mint I see is on the edges of wooded areas, in areas that are not as accessible to mowing. That would be probably more desirable once you start seeing Perilla mint in its later growth stages, to just mow or clip it, but you may not be able to get good access to it.
The other one along that line was best time of year for Perilla mint.
Probably midsummer. It's another summer annual species.
Okay. Had a couple on Sharpen. Will Sharpen kill Clover?
I'm still trying to sort that out. I have seen Clover survive. Let me leave it at that. The labeling does not claim anything relative to Clover. It's basically, the labeling is states for grass pastures, but I have seen survivability of Clover. Let me leave it at that.
Okay. And then Chris Ammerman asked, Sharpen was marketed in grain crops to suppress grasses during the growing season. Was any suppression of the grassy weeds noted in the trials?
No, and I'm not sure I understand his comment there about suppressing grasses. Sharpen's more of a broadleaf herbicide. That's where it targets mainly. The other thing is, the grasses that we have in these grass pastures are perennial, typically well-established grasses. So I have not seen an effect on grasses other than maybe a little bit of leaf tip burn.
Okay. How to control goldenrod and when?
Goldenrod is a perennial species. And again, it's one of those that it's out there in the middle of the summer. We don't recognize it and see it until it begins to flower in late summer, but it is truly a perennial. I don't have any direct experience with goldenrod as far as any specific trials that I have done. It's been some goldenrod in a few plots. I did it several years ago when we were looking a lot at the Grazon type products. But I suspect that the Grazon or Duracor, as well as the triclopyr herbicides like Crossbow, should be effective on it. Whether Weed Master would get the job done, I'm not sure.
Isn't that the state flower? Is it legal to kill it? Just a joke. All right.
Just a joke. Well, there is one species of goldenrod that's on the endangered species list, but that's another issue.
All right. Having trouble with wild barley in hay fields. What do I need to do?
Wild barley in hay fields. I assume they're talking about little barley. It's a summer annual grass. It's more than likely showing up in the early spring before the other desirable grasses are getting started for the year. It may be one of those situations, if you have a heavy population of this little barley, it may be one of those situations you might want to rotate that into a different cropping system for a few years to work on the little barley, because there are no selective herbicides that will help you with that situation.
Yeah, that's a tough one, trying to get a grass out of a grass. How about milkweed control?
Actually, milkweed is one of the harder weeds to control with the herbicides we have today. As far as selective control, let me qualify that. If you're talking about milkweed that may be out in a pasture field, probably the best thing to do is mow it. But even some of those upper end herbicides are not known to be very effective on on the common milkweed especially. The herbicide that works the best that we can use in pastures would be a glyphosate or Roundup, but that you're talking about a spot treatment and you're going to kill out your desirable grasses in the area that you treat. So I don't have any good answers for that one other than mechanical control.
Okay. Evan Tate was wondering, should we rotate the chemistries of Grazon and Duracor?
I don't know if there would be that much difference, again, between those two products, because again, the primary driver for the tougher weeds that those two products would provide control for is the Aminopyralic.
Okay. Dr. Limcooler asked if AGR 207 Pasture Weed ID Pub and Control Pub are available online yet.
Though it should be available through the UK Extension Publication Series. So if they would just do a Google search for broadleaf weed control Kentucky, that should come up.
Okay. Any suggestion for getting rid of Nimblewheel?
Well, Nimblewheel is another one of those grasses that it's kind of interesting. It's a grass that animals typically don't graze very readily. There are no good answers for it. The couple situations, I mean, it's been a real problem in horse farms for years. Particularly fields that get grazed heavily. Once it gets started, it's a perennial, warm season perennial at that. So as our cool season grasses are on the decline, it's really in its full active growth in midsummer. It may be a little bit of an indication, but just kind of changing up some management practices may help give more advantage to the cool season grasses. But once it gets a real foothold in a field, it may require some serious renovation in order to try to reduce that population.
Okay. And I think I've heard you on a field day talk about this, but I don't remember the answer. Which of the herbicides work on horse nettle better than another?
That is where I probably want to lean more towards the Aminopyralic based herbicides to get the best control. And when I say best control, it may be 70 to 80% reduction in population the next year. So I expect the Duracor would probably do as good of a job as Grazon next. The problem with the horse nettle is the root system underneath the ground is a network of fine roots, creeping rootstocks, if you will. They may not be much bigger than a pencil, but they can go deep and they can spread out. And it's trying to get herbicide into those plants and down into the root system is much more difficult.
Okay. Now here's one of my favorites. What's the best herbicide to control multi-floral rose bush in a fence row?
Well, I think that's another one of our success stories of the last 30 years or so, is that the kind of multi-floral rose out there is less than it used to be. And a lot of it's because I think we have used a fair amount of triclopyr based herbicides, things like crossbow, for example, has worked pretty well as a foliar treatment. Applying it, even glyphosate as a foliar treatment, as a spot treatment, will work pretty well also, as well as the metsulfuron herbicides. So the key to it is the timing of the application. I think when it fully leaves out in the spring is a good time to target that plant. Another technique depends on if you're dealing with the large clumps of multi-floral rose, where it's a lot more difficult to, I mean, you may have to use a much higher volume spray gun to get to some of those areas. But if you have some sites where you can get access to them, once we get to this cold temperature, there is what's known as a dormant spray treatment, you take the straight herbicide out of the jug and you spray the base of the canes. So it's kind of a basal cane treatment. That's something that can be done here in a few weeks. As long as the ground's not frozen is basically what the label states. And if we can target that before it begins to leaf out by late March, that can be another effective tool to deal with that one.
Good deal. Okay. What were the results on the herbicides that were tested with the hope that they would not take out clovers?
I'm not sure exactly what they're getting at, other than the fact that there is a product that's being evaluated and may be on the market fairly soon, called Proclova. And it is another, it's a newer, would be a newer herbicide product, but when they talk about clover survivability, they're talking about white clover, because red clover is still susceptible to that herbicide.
Okay.
But even white clover you might see damage on white clover, at least initially with it. So it's still not available for use yet.
Okay. Dr. Green, we still have several questions. Are you willing to hang with us and go? Or we sort of go until they're ready to quit unless you need to go?
I'll keep answering questions as best I can.
All right. And folks, if you need to go, we appreciate you joining us. And like I say, we kind of take care of business until we fall asleep or can't do it anymore or lose questions. So if you need to go, we certainly understand. All right. Next question. What's the best herbicide to control pigweed?
The pigweed, I'm assuming we're talking about spiny pigweed or spiny amaranth. Again, that's a plant that I can easily control with 2,4-D if it's applied when it's young. So 2,4-D, Weed Master, Grazon, all those herbicides work well, but the best time to treat it would be more in June to get the best results.
Okay. All right. How about Lespedesia?
Typically, when I think about Lespedesia, and if specifically, well, there's a couple different species that are unique. The Cerisa Lespedesia, which may be what they're talking about, I usually turn people more towards the triclopyr-based herbicides like Crossbow to get the best results on it. The other annual Lespedesia, well, again, I would probably turn more towards Crossbow or triclopyr-based herbicide, or maybe Weed Master would give you some help there.
Okay. I see Dr. Van Valen posted a link for you guys in the chat if you want that pub that Dr. Lemcooler was talking about. So it's in there.
Okay, so thank you.
All right. Is there any benefit to dormant seeding over winter to help increase stands in the spring to reduce weed competition, or preferentially seed just fall or spring?
Well, in general, we typically think about the grasses are best to do the seeding in the fall of the year to get the grasses off to a good start. Whereas we typically seed our clover here in the late winter, early spring. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to try to get those grasses and or clovers up and growing so that they fill in those bare spots. And that's what we're after. The environmental conditions don't always cooperate with us to get the stand we need, but sometimes we've got to be a little patient and try to deal with some of the weedy vegetation that we might experience under some of those circumstances. One of the dilemmas we run into is obviously if we put clover in there, then we're highly restricted about using any herbicides after that plant germinates. With the grasses, we have to wait until we have in general, I'd say a well-established root system before we make any over-the-top herbicide applications.
Okay. Dr. Van Valen had one off of our Facebook feed. How long after frost seeding clover can you spray?
Well, again, most of the herbicides that we have available to us are going to take out those young clover seedlings. So if you're thinking about frost seeding clover and spraying, don't go hand in hand. We have to decide on one or the other. So there are some cases where we might need to deal with the weed control issue and wait another year before we reestablish the clovers.
Makes sense. Okay, back to the Lespedesia. What about timing on that, Dr. Green?
On the, assuming we're talking about Sericea Lespedesia, probably midsummer would be ideal before it gets too rank in growth. If it's an area that could be mowed or clipped first in late June, early July, and then let the regrowth come back, and then spray it more towards August, that would even be better. But if that's not desirable, then I'd probably target more into after it starts its active growth and it gets to be about 6 to 12 inches tall.
All right. I hate to tell you, but it looks like we may be to the end of questions unless anybody can type really, really fast and get one in. Otherwise, we're going to shut this thing down. Sure appreciate everybody joining us tonight, and especially you, Dr. Green. This was fantastic, and I have to say you've won the award for most questions asked and answered after one of these. So obviously a very, very hot topic for a lot of folks. And like I say, we thought it was very timely, and sure appreciate you joining us tonight.
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to share with your group. And as we can tell, we could probably spend another couple of hours and still not cover everything. But there's a lot of different issues that the producers deal with. And hopefully we shared a few nuggets of things and some thoughts to help people deal with some of those issues going forward into the coming season.
All right. I've got one more quick one for you, Dr. Green. I have a lease farm that has a lot of woody sticks coming up. I'm not sure what that is, but you might. Used 2,4-D last year. What would you use this year?
Oh, I'm clueless
Okay.
as to what that may be that they're concerned about.
Might want to clarify that if you're still on here. And I don't know if that's actual small trees trying to grow or what that might be.
If it's a
trees, he's saying.
okay. Well, if we're talking about trees, I typically will lean more towards the again, the Triclopyr products, and I seem to think Pasture Guard seems to help us a little bit more, maybe to even crossbow on some species. But either one of those would be my choice. But the timing of the year would be more late summer. I get a few calls in the spring of the year. People start getting out and getting active, and they start wanting to spray fence rows for woody plant growth and so forth. But I think if we wait until the fall, late summer, let me say late summer, I'm talking about August, early September, before these plants begin to drop leaves, where we still have some active growth, we tend to get more herbicide into those plants and into the root system of the plant and get the most benefit from that.
All right. Now this is going to be the last one, I promise, Dr. Green, but best time about treating foxtail and timing.
Well, with foxtail, I didn't mention it yet tonight. There are the herbicide options to control foxtail. We're taking grass out of a grass is about limited to none, except we now can use Prowl H2O. It's a pendimethalin product that can be used in forage crops, grass forage crops. Let me qualify that. the key to that, though, it has to be in the ground before the weed seed germinate. And it's almost impossible to tell you when that's going to happen, because it's highly dependent upon temperature and environmental conditions for that seed to germinate, beginning in late spring to early summer. And I suspect there's a good possibility they're probably dealing with a hay field more so than maybe a pasture field, although we do have foxtails and pastures as well. But if it is a hay field, I think from my limited experience at this point in time, there's not likely to be any foxtail in that first cutting of hay. But just as soon as you take that hay off and get it out of the field, put on the herbicide to get the herbicide hopefully in the ground, and rainfall to get it down in contact with some of those germinating seed to help minimize the problem. There's not a good answer for that situation, even with that herbicide chemistry, because it's so different than all the other herbicides available we have in these forage crops.
Shoot, if I didn't have foxtail, I wouldn't have any grass at all. Don't kill my foxtail. All right, thanks a lot, Dr. Green, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. If you're still on here, I hope you know that the next one is on March the 2nd, The Importance of Body Condition Scoring and the Cost of Milk Production by Dr. Limcooler and Van Balen. So please join us then, and everybody stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you in a few weeks.